Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to Old Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is Dr. Gemma Gibson, who's a sociologist, and her research focuses on the fat activist movement, the contemporary body positive movement, and the health at every size movement. A couple of her recent publications are Healthism at Every Size, The Duties of the Good Fatty, and Just There for the Fashion Basically, Politicized Femininity and the Fat O Sphere. Dr. Gibson, thanks for coming on to Old Bodies Outside.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to learn about your research today. And so I first wanted to hear about where you connecting in from.
I'm from the UK. I'm in England. I'm in New York at the moment. But I work.
So what university are you at?
I'm at the University of Sheffield. I'm in the Department of Sociological Studies there, where we do things like sociology, which I am. We do social work, and we have a pathway called Digital
Nice.
Media
Well, I am a
Society.
big fan of the world of social science. My research actually is very conservation oriented, and we use a lot of social psychology approaches to understand how to boost conservation ethic, societally speaking. And so it's a topic that I love hearing about. Yeah.
Great. Good. Yeah, it's the social sciences are expansive, can be useful for
Very
many
expansive.
things.
And it's interesting, my research, despite that, as I mentioned, I use these social psychology approaches, but we have a strong relationship with geography too. And I guess that's, looking at different parks and protected areas and their locations and how people interact differently in different locations and whatnot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Not necessarily in my area, but I have heard lots of interesting papers on it sort of in my
well, it's one of the things I really love a
well.
lot about doing this podcast is connecting with fellow researchers and getting to learn about their research. I mean, it's like just a really fun pause in my day. And it's something that's always just really fantastic and always kind of just warms my heart to learn about other research that's out there outside of my field.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thing to do because I think so much this kind of great information can stay within the university. So doing things like this, I think, is really
and
really
it's interesting how that works. Sometimes the research, a lot of the times, does stay within the universities, and it can be hard for the general public to find some of the manuscripts that are published that have a lot of great information and knowledge and utility too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's especially sort of an odd thing. And it's something we're really conscientious of sort of in sociology, is that if we're writing about people should be able to access that information as well. You can't just write about them and sort of keep it within our ivory tower. So yeah, doing podcasts and media in other ways, I think, is a really, really great way to kind of share all this interesting stuff we're finding out, actually. And useful stuff that
Well, thank you. Do you ever I have not no, I've done it once, I think. Once. Do you publish outside of academic journals? Like, do you ever do an article or blog post, stuff like that?
Yeah, so I have done. I had contributed to a website that's called Food, I can't never get the S the right way around, Food, Fatness, Fitness, where I wrote a little bit about health at every size there. And then so we get press requests quite often. So I try to give quotes sort of as often, working in kind of around fat studies, it can be difficult to figure out which of the publications genuinely asking. But I try to give kind of quotes sort of as often as possible. But I know sort of the conversations obviously are a really good resource, and I think doing good stuff in there, kind of getting academics to write shorter, more accessible things.
And you've done a lot of writing. One thing I was really impressed with is I think that you've got maybe a couple solo publications too, where you've put everything into it yourself, and I was really impressed by that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was really lucky actually with the two publications you mentioned. They're both open access. So I have been sort of lucky to be able to find places that were doing that, and I can kind of make that research as accessible as possible. I think it gets harder the more you publish, but it's something I'm quite dedicated
Yeah, and
to.
I feel like with a lot of the journals I publish with, when I want to go open access, there's a fee associated with it, and the fee can be quite steep. There was one. Okay, so this is common. There was one. There was a.
Yeah. So sometimes you can get other
Yeah,
places to fund them,
and
which is good. Sometimes you
exactly.
can't.
So that's some similarities we have right there. So I've both ways. One was with the partner that I was doing research for, had provided grant money. They really wanted to see the research get out to a broader audience, so they were big fans of the open access route, and they were willing to pay that charge. And that charge in the United States was about, I think, $2,500. So quite steep. And then there's also been the time where my department was like, hey, we really want to see this research get out there. We're willing to invest in it being open access as well. Yeah.
That's great.
Well, and
that's really good. Yeah, but it's an extra hurdle, I suppose, in the publishing
it is
process.
an extra hurdle, but going back to kind of what we were talking about with getting research out to a broader audience, so they can use that information, and help make society a better place and make people's lives better, and it's all important to do. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start talking about your research. And so, in the introduction, I mentioned that your research focuses on the fat activist movement, the contemporary body positive movement, and the health at every size movement. Do you mind describing each of these and maybe touching on how they each view health?
Yeah. So it's one of these tricky things. So my PhD research, which I hope to be turning into a monograph very soon, focuses on on the history of the body positive movement, but as it kind of came to be through fat activism. And one of the things that I sort of mentioned when I was writing this, and I continuously try to mention, so I mention it here immediately, is that we can't write a history, right? Because with so many people involved in this, we can write multiple histories. So there is probably, with body positivity, fat activism, and health at every size, there isn't one specific way to look at health. Okay. So I suppose I could cut, in terms of health at every size, this is a very simplistic way of putting it, because the way that sort of people will interact with it themselves, the way that healthcare professional might interact with it, a way an activist might interact with it could all be very different. But it is sort of as it says. It's very most simplistic. It's the idea that the pursuit of health, or you can be healthy sort of at any size. Okay, so it is a tricky one, because there are kind of multiple ways to approach this. And one of the first ways that I came across health at every size, kind of as a fat person myself, was sort of thinking of methods from other fat activists to help me kind of interact with medical professionals, where I was trying to get health care for things that kind of were not necessarily impacted by my weight, and kind of giving me tools and resources to have these conversations with healthcare professionals. So health at every size now is kind of it's actually been trademarked, and the Association for Size Diversity and Health have kind of guidelines that they are actually currently kind of editing, but there are ways of kind of approaching health at every size as a healthcare practitioner too, not focusing on diet and exercise specifically as kind of the healthcare, and even if you are focusing on diet and exercise, it's not necessarily for weight loss, it's for general good health. So I would say, sort of based on my research, but just bear in mind I can write sort of just one perspective of the history. I'm sure there are many more. That health at every size kind of came out of meetings that was happening around in California in sort of the 1970s, where people were having these conversations around how to get better access to healthcare. these are fat activists sort of coming out of the National Association to Aid Fat Acceptance, but not necessarily associated with them anymore, which we can talk about later, and sort of, finding ways to navigate kind of quite punitive healthcare systems that were quite focused on weight loss. I think that fat activism still holds those. It's difficult, it's a very large thing, but I think that fat activism and a lot of fat activists still holds those kind of central ideas quite true. That health at every size is kind of about accessing healthcare and being able to get equal healthcare kind of as a fat person. What I noticed in my research on body positivity, which I worked from Charlotte Cooper's idea that body positivity is what we call sort of a proxy of fat activism, meaning that sometimes it stands in for fat activism, but it's not necessarily the same things. And in many cases, it kind of contradicts some of the key ideas of fat activism. But body positivity, what I kept seeing is that people saying that they were sort of influencers or people involved in body positivity were committed to health at every size. But actually, these were kind of revolving around very specific health behaviours that were kind of moralising in a very specific way, which I can pick up on later. I know this was only the introductory question.
Yeah, no, and feel free to. Yeah, no, you can get into some of those details and whatnot. And I thought it was interesting that it's referred to as the contemporary body positive movement, and so that means some change has occurred, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you had kind of the founder of the Body Positive on here, the organisation. I did see that, yeah. So I don't know. I wouldn't say necessarily that the stuff kind of involved with fat activism is. So I looked at themes basically. So body positive has sort of got started using sort of in the late, I'd say maybe not until the 2000s. But I found in my research that there were kind of body positive behaviours kind of existing sort of long before that, right? But could it be categorised as a movement in its own right necessarily? Probably not. Probably falling under things like the Black is Beautiful movement, the natural hair movement, or the fat activist movement, right? So body positivity, I think, for me, is kind of recognizable by that keyword positivity, right? So the ideas around it, they're very positive. They are about these, I mean, they are quite woolly concepts around kind of self-love and increased representation. It's not, I would say, I think Virgie Tovar said this, it's not necessarily a political tool, body positivity. What it can do is but I suppose I do believe that body positivity can be beneficial in some ways, in that it can kind of, if you are at a point in kind of your body difficulty where you feel uncomfortable when you get dressed or when you go to work, and body positivity, these narratives help you, then that's great. I think when I refer to the contemporary body positivity movement, I'm referring to when we started calling it that. So for me, 31, so I was on Tumblr at a very formative time. So for me, I really recognize kind of body positivity increases with kind of the increase of microblogging in general, actually. So Twitter, Tumblr, those representation ideas that actually we see kind of as representative in right now, actually. We still seeing either very short videos or pictures. And that seems to be the extent of what a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people understand about body positivity. And that's certainly what mainstream media understands about body positivity, right? It's about representation. It's about feeling good.
Yeah, and that's where I've come across body positivity is social media posts. And I follow a lot of runners, and there's a lot of body positivity in runners too. But I wasn't able to gain like a full grasp on it through social media, because there's a lot of different viewpoints, perspectives, and opinions about it too. But I was figuring that the contemporary part probably came about as the internet became something of more of a social use, and it became an effective social tool. That maybe that's when the contemporary kind of started. That maybe that was the.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably what I would categorize it as. But those themes around representation, inclusion, and self-love, we can see kind of evidence of them in the fat activist movement and other movements such earlier on. But it was the internet that kind of really galvanized this movement, right? That kind of encouraged it to become a movement. This is when we started seeing it kind of having impact on the mainstream media as well. So Tess Holliday, who was famously touted as the world's first plus size supermodel, who I believed at the time wore a US size 22. She was on the cover of People. I think she's also been an Elle since then. And there's a question, isn't there, about whether that would have happened if we hadn't had that social media kind of galvanization, to use that word again.
Right. Interesting. There's a lot going on out there. And it sounds like there's also one of the things when I was rereading one of your articles, also, before I get into that question, actually, though, I wanted to hear about what's the name of the journal that you often publish in, and when did that journal come about? How long has that journal been around?
So that's the Fat Studies Journal, and it was started by Esther Rothblum, and it has been, I think, around longer than you would think. And I'm just checking it right now. So it did celebrate 10 years, actually. So it looks like the first issue was in 2012, actually. And this is actually when we saw kind of an increase in fat studies around that time too. So there was I've forgotten the name of it, but there was an essay collection that is on my bookshelf. I've forgotten the name of, but it's like a really great the Fat Studies Reader. It's a really great introductory text. And that was published not at a dissimilar time. So that was published in 2009. So we were kind of seeing sort of an increased academic interest sort of in that time period, around the time period actually that social media use. I don't know if this is relevant, this is connected or not, but around the time you're seeing sort of an increase in social media usage in this specific way, or an ease at using social media. So no, the Fat Studies Journal is great. They take stuff from sort of all sorts of disciplines, and I guess the main focus of it is that in the Fat Studies Journal we focus on kind of almost a political experience of fatness. So very different from what we'd often call kind of obesity studies, which focuses on kind of obesity and treats obesity as though there was something to be done about it. So Fat Studies is very different. It focuses on more the social elements.
And that sounds like it kind of sums you up too with your research with being a sociologist. And I think that social aspect is really important to research. But it's also great to hear that Fat Studies, the journal, takes on a lot of different disciplines, because it all kind of comes together. And maybe there might be some research from the medical industry, also the social industry. And that's two things that, I think are really important to come together. And I think one thing that is nice if that connection does come together is for medical professionals to be able to see this, the social science and what's going on socially, so they can incorporate that into their approaches too, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. And there are, the issue I was published in focused specifically on what we call, or one of the issues I was published in, what we call kind of healthism. So the idea that healthism being the idea that people who are healthy are treated better, people who are unhealthy experience stigma and stuff like that. So, which is a real thing. So, the Fat Studies stuff, it does do stuff like that, and it's sort of what it aims to do as well.
And I gotta imagine it's probably more common than not, where there's doctors inadvertently or maybe purposefully, but one way or the other, hold on to a stigma when they are meeting with certain patients, and they may not give those patients the type of professional expertise that they should. And so, how are those circumstances navigated?
Mm-hmm. So I suppose one thing to consider is that we all have those social stigmas, right? So even fat people ourselves. So we know that kind of fat people, we go to doctors, and we are almost often, not everyone, but we are often quite ready to hear this kind of this derision about weight and things like that, and it's, these are the messages that we're getting from kind of the media, from family, from friends, even subtly, and it's going to be difficult not to take those on board. But for doctors and kind of healthcare practitioners specifically, it is part of their training. That obesity, this idea, isn't there, that obesity is a disease, and what do healthcare practitioners do? They treat disease. So there's this idea that we could or should, we both could and should promote kind of a weight neutral approach to healthcare. So I'm not necessarily kind of a health at every size expert. There are medical professionals who are experts in doing this, and do great work in sort of giving training and writing resources for healthcare professionals on how to kind of treat their patients. But in terms of being a patient, one of the things that I often get asked about is what do I do when I go in for something like my tonsils and my doctor starts talking about my weight. One question I suppose you can ask is how would you treat this if I was a thin person, and things like that. And it's a really difficult thing to navigate, actually, like I said, because it's built into our society, but also your training as a doctor, as a health practitioner. So yeah, there are lots of kind of methods at like approaching that. And as I said, the Association for Size, Diversity and Health, they're looking at kind of rejigging their guidelines, but they do have kind of lots of resources available sort of on their website, which I would recommend people look at.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get back to hearing about your research. And so what some of the questions I wanted to ask were about health at every size, but I think it might be kind of interesting. I mentioned your two articles in the introduction. I was wondering if you can kind of sum up each article and just kind of tell us what those publications are about, if you don't mind. And, so you got the one that's Healthism at Every Size: The Duties of the Good Fatty. And I think one thing that I'm curious about with that, and I did read it, but I think I'm curious for that information being transmitted to the listeners, and the words "good fatty," I think might catch people off guard, and I think that that's something that's really important to discuss, because there's social signals around the good fatty. I think that people aren't aware of those signals that are out there, and they're pretty prominent. And so that was something that I found really curious in that article. So if you don't mind kind of talking a little bit about that article and what is meant by the good fatty.
Yeah, so it's not my term, actually. It is a term that we sort of use there's kind of this dichotomy, right, of the good fatty and the bad fatty, and it's kind of term that's often been used sort of in jest within fat activist circles, likely before I was even born. So I didn't necessarily come up with that terminology, but it's this idea and an approach to health, really, that suggests there are kind of two, according to kind of the mainstream culture in the West, there are kind of two ways to be fat. There's the good fatty and there's the bad fatty. So the bad fatty, what do? Well, they don't exercise. They likely kind of engage in these caricatures of fatness that don't actually exist. Think Homer Simpson, I think, that kind of idea. And it's kind of the Charlotte Cooper has written about this idea of the headless fatties, which is the fat people you see on the news with their heads cut off when they're talking about the obesity crisis, maybe eating fast food, maybe struggling to walk and things like that. So the good fatty then is based on this idea from Lebesco's work around the will to innocence. So that is people who are, at least in my article and kind of what Lebesco is saying as well, are people who are made innocent of their fat bodies by other kind of health promoting behaviours. So in my article, I wrote about 3 health promoting behaviours that could kind of make you innocent of your fatness. So the first one is to kind of have good health numbers beyond your BMI. So BMI, you'll often hear this kind of repeated, and it's true. It is kind of, it's an outdated tool. It wasn't used to measure health. It shouldn't be used to measure health. So it's the idea of kind of disregarding BMI and looking at other things like your blood glucose numbers, like your cholesterol numbers, like your heart healthy numbers in general, actually. So your blood pressure and things like that. So if you've got numbers that are good in that regard, that's your first one done. The other is kind of healthy eating. So making sure that you don't engage, again, that I don't know if many fat people do, but sort of even if they did, it says nothing of their morality, sort of this indulgent overeating that we often see represented in kind of mainstream media. Again, think Homer Simpson. So as long as you're eating your kale salads, you're eating your quinoa, great, good. And the third one is kind of the will, and I also call it the ability to exercise. Because we know not everyone has the ability to exercise. So to make sure you are going to the gym, to make sure you are going on walks, you are always moving your body. And if you do these 3 things, you are sort of made innocent by society standards of your fatness. It's not your fault. So the problem with that, obviously, is, like I said, I don't come from a health background, but I do very much believe that in a society, if we're working towards kind of a society where social justice is important, and it's something we're going to prioritise, we can't decide who gets access to healthcare and who gets access to basic human rights based on things that we believe to be moral, like good health. So that's sort of what that article is about. And I use some examples of kind of body positive text to kind of see how this was sort of quite subtly being spoken about. But the primary text I focus on is the one that comes up for a lot of people, which is Lindo Bacon's Health at Every Size. Lindo had previously had quite a long career in Health at Every Size. And it's a book that I had been aware of, but I didn't read until I did my PhD. I'm a lifelong fat person, but I didn't read this book until I came to do my PhD. And it just wasn't what I was expecting. There was a lot of stuff in there about how to... So primarily the book takes what it calls a weight neutral approach, that you shouldn't have to lose weight to be healthy. But then there's quite a lot of strange advice in there around things like eating less fat, eating off a much smaller plate, these kind of ways of eating that are very much about calorie restriction without calling it that, which is tricky, and also kind of a focus on exercise. So suggesting, there's a bit in that book that suggests people in chair dancing, people in wheelchairs could participate in chair dancing, for example, which I think I probably find quite tricky, because people are not necessarily restricted by the wheelchair itself. People are often in wheelchairs because of pain, and dancing is, it's a tricky thing, you know. It's it just wasn't what I was expecting. There's been lots of kind of written about Lindo Bacon since. Lindo's written a lot of work themselves that's kind of built on that very early book, actually, Health at Every Size. It didn't come out quite a while ago. And there are some other things going on kind of relevant to that now, but it just wasn't what I was expecting, coming from, I suppose, this more radical approach to health at every size that came from kind of fat activism, that was sort of very focused on how do I navigate healthcare systems.
Well, and it seemed like there was that kind of cover up for almost it's just almost a couple weight loss tactics versus being more holistic and also looking at these social perceptions, the stigma, being respected as a human being.
So the book is expansive, as is Lindo's career, is one thing. But I think it's tricky for me, kind of, and I think for other people, fat people who have been harmed by healthcare practitioners, which Lindo, I think, still is, or at least was, and to see any of this in a book like that. So like there are good parts of that book. There is good work being done by healthcare practitioners who are invested in health at every size. But I suppose for me it was quite reflective of the way that, when we don't necessarily involve fat people in our approaches to weight neutral healthcare, tricky things like this can come up. So that's, I think, it's there were a few parts of the book that were great, a few parts of the book that were really not great. And I think that I was seeing, as body positivity became more popular, I think that I was seeing the not so great parts being picked up a lot more than the workable parts, the actual workable parts that could further social justice.
You brought up a really good point there, that it seems like some of these ideas and topics are formulated without consulting people that have experienced them and had to go through that treacherous navigation. That just doesn't seem, that seems ineffective.
Yeah, I think so. And what is really great to see is kind of, I actually saw that, the Association for Size, Diversity and Health are doing that, which is great. And I think I saw fairly recently, and I think it's recorded on their website as well, they actually did firstly, as there's advocacy and community leader is a fat person, and they have fat person working as the now, which is great. But they also did something with NAFA, NAFA's chair. That's the National Association to, I forget, because they've had a changing, and I spend a lot of time talking about the historical version. They've had a change. So the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. So Tigris Osborne is also a fat black person. And they recently did an event with them that was cool. It was called on fat activism in Hayes. So we are sort of seeing these movements, and as I said, fat people have been doing this work the whole time. It's just, it's similar to body positivity, right? It's the power that these institutions can have in kind of popularizing social movements or even political tools. So if you are a thin white professional, unfortunately, people are going to pay more attention to you than they are fat people themselves. So I suppose it's thinking about that process of professionalization and how we make sure that this work is, the work that fat people are doing is kind of being heard and recognized as well. And like I said, I do think that kind of the Association for Size, Diversity and Health are doing that work, which is positive, I suppose, and I'm sure we'll continue seeing that elsewhere. It does really feel at the moment, without going into it too much, like tides are turning, which is
So it hopefully it's not just being heard, but it's being incorporated and used too, right? And I think that's the tide changing probably.
Absolutely.
It's going from some voices getting out to now it's like, okay, like this is a societal problem with way people are perceiving other people. They're not respecting them. And so with that tide changing, hopefully a lot of that information, knowledge is getting incorporated, getting used.
Yeah. That's and I that is part of the work that organisation do as well. It's part of the work that the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance are doing as well. I'm obviously British, so we have. It's not that they don't exist, but we have fewer large-scale organisations like this in the UK, and our approaches to healthcare are slightly different as well. I say slightly different. We have free at the point of delivery healthcare, but the National Health Service is under significant stress at the moment, meaning that you will make months for a doctor's appointment. You can be waiting years for treatment from hospitals. So if you get a doctor who's very focused on your weight, you don't really get to say, I want another doctor. It is unlikely you will get another doctor. So, it's a different. Yeah, it's a very different system. Obviously, great that we have this system, but it is underfunded. It is strained, and for a long time, actually, sort of relevant to what we're talking about, the blame for that strain was kind of. Yeah. Meanwhile, our government have been perpetually underfunding. Their favoured model is a part private, part public, and it has been for a long time. It looks like suggesting that we're potentially moving towards a private healthcare system. So it's if your doctor or your dietitian or your consultant or your nurse does or says something fatphobic, yes, there are ways to complain about it. It's unlikely you'll kind of get to change very easily. You'll get to change kind of physicians.
Well, probably very quickly really too. Difficult. You might have to wait another few months to see another physician.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing as well is that we have this weird system where we don't necessarily have primary care doctors. So you have a doctor's surgery and you book an appointment and it's sort of anyone you could see, because it's so stretched and people are running around all over the place. So putting kind of weight neutral healthcare into the NHS isn't impossible, but it is a significantly large task.
Yeah. And Gemma, this is such an interesting piece of our conversation, because I'm familiar with the United States healthcare program, and we're always, there's always reasons to be upset with it. And so we're always like, gosh, we need a free healthcare system like in England. But it sounds like, there's oh my gosh, issues both ways. And so I was thinking of something that recently occurred with my mother. She suffered a heart attack, and the cardiologist that she's been going to after the heart attack was not giving her the time of day. He'd come in, look over her reports for like 2 minutes and say, you're good to go, see you in a few months. And that was it. And she's like, hey, I would prefer if I had a doctor that had a more holistic approach. We're looking at, my lifestyle, on top of my history and stuff like that. And so she was able to be like, you know what, I'm going to be done with this doctor. He's not really interacting with me. It doesn't seem like he cares. It doesn't seem like he's compassionate. So I'm going to go over to this doctor and get a new doctor. So I guess that's, I took that for granted until you just started talking.
Yeah. I'm firstly sorry to hear that, but yeah, it's a really tricky system, I think, to navigate, and there are people doing lots and lots of great work, but kind of getting, even in the US, getting kind of people to listen to this when it, as I said, it's part of their training. Part of your training is the idea that obesity is a disease. So kind of undoing that, and especially from an outside organization.
Well, look how hard it's been to get rid of BMI. I feel like everyone knows that BMI is just it's not useful. And it continues to be used. It continues to be talked about and taught in elementary schools and middle schools. And it's just like, I feel like BMI it's been done with for so long, but it continues to persevere somehow.
So the city I live in, York, a few years ago, maybe it was about 2016, they were the first city to bring in a policy that said sort of if you need sort of non-urgent surgery, the NHS could make you wait up to a year, or they could give it to you sooner if you lost a certain percentage of your body fat. So if you're waiting for things like a hip surgery, I mean, it's difficult, and lots would say kind of impossible to lose weight healthily, right? But it having a hip surgery, if you cannot move, so that's not even exercising, that's talking about cooking for yourself and things like that. How are you supposed to lose a significant portion of weight? But that year as well, York, the city, also won a human rights award.
Very interesting. Okay, York is quite the collision of things going on.
Yeah, very, very odd. Very difficult kind of approach to fatness, kind of in the UK, and I mean in the US as well. I obviously have more experience of living sort of in the UK, where fatness is very linked to race and class and even our gender and things like that. So it's how you approach these medical care systems and the treatment you'll get within these medical systems is balances on more than kind of just your weight. And we talk about intersectionality and how all these things can play in to make things more difficult, and fatness is a key one.
Yeah, and I would think that that intersectionality piece too just really compounds it. If you're also a marginalized person, if you're also female, like it's just things are getting tougher and tougher and tougher. It's a compounding effect, and then it almost feels like you may not even be able to work positively with maybe some types of professionals, medical professionals.
Yeah. I mean, we know there are restrictions on kind of gender affirming healthcare for people who are trans around being fat. So specifically for top surgery and things like that, there are barriers to receiving that if you're fat. There is I believe the cutoff point, it could be, I think it's 30 in some districts and 35 in others for IVF treatment. So you cannot get access to those treatments if you are fat. And these are policies. Wild. So it's
I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Should we talk about your second article that I mentioned in the introduction, and that was titled "Just There for the Fashion," basically politicized femininity in the fat O sphere. And this title's got three things to it that really jump out to me. And first off is just there for the fashion, basically. And so, there's an emphasis there that you put in there specifically. The politicized femininity, you broke up femininity into femininity, and between, in parentheses, wrote me. Mm-hmm. So that stands out in the title. And then fatosphere stands out in the title too. So there's a number of things going on in your title.
Yeah. So that article is sort of less on health, but I mean, when we talk about fatness, we always have to talk about health at some point. But it's out of my research, sort of more specifically on the body positivity movement. It's looking at when body positivity, for me, I think first started growing a name for itself, kind of beyond for activism and beyond these other movements we've touched on. So I think for a lot of people, and again, there's very limited criticism I have for individuals for doing this. I think for a lot of people, body positivity is about representation and it's about clothing. And actually, I think that clothing's really important. You need to be able to dress appropriately for work. You want to be able to dress appropriately for events and weddings. And we know that people do get treated better if they are dressed, quote unquote, well, whatever that means within a given context. So clothing I think it's a very important political issue. But it's also really important when it comes to things like gender, right? So the way that you dress to kind of communicate your gender is important to a lot of people. So this article kind of picks up on that, right? So it talks sort of a little bit about this idea of tainted femininity. So that's the idea. Again, not my idea. It's a thing that lots of queer people talk about. The idea that kind of femininity on queer people is somewhat tainted, and I'm kind of saying, lots of other people have been saying as well that femininity on fatness is also tainted in a way as well. So it's not this femininity we've come to understand. So the Barbie trailers just came out yesterday. I don't know if you've seen them, but for me, so my cousin is a little bit older than me. So I got all her hand-me-down Barbies from the 80s that had very large hair and pink sparkly dresses, and of course they're all very thin with long hair. And for me, and I think for a lot of people, this is femininity, right? And femininity is often characterized by thinness and daintiness and not taking up too much space, because it often exists in opposition to masculinity, which is often about being big, it's about being strong, okay? So this femininity, this odd spelling of femininity, again, it's not mine, it's one we use a lot, and it is a play on the idea of kind of being femme. So you are kind of the tainted femininity that you has is kind of queered, and it becomes femme in some way, which is a term that historically sort of lesbians have used to recognize feminine lesbians. So I'm kind of talking about how fashion and clothing can be really political when it comes to fat activism, because what you are kind of saying is there's this idea that fat people can be kind of desexualized. They're often like the funny fat friend. But if you identify as a feminine person, if you are a feminine person, you engage in this femininity, it's still tainted, but you can claim this political identity of femme. And you can play with these feminine styles in a slightly different way. It's something that I think that I sort of experienced myself, and sort of as kind of, we spoke a little bit about Tumblr, we spoke a little about Twitter, and obviously sort of Instagram as well. We kind of seen these kind of representations of femininity play out. I suppose the issue that we now have is almost these identities that I think sort of 2005-ish felt really radical, like, oh, I'm dressing feminine in a feminine way, and fat women don't normally do that. Now it's almost seems quite expected, that I am as put together as a thin person. It's another one of those moral duties. It's not necessarily about health, but it's another one of those kind of moral duties. And the question is that actually kind of liberating? Is it liberating that I can be just like everyone else except fat?
Right.
Is that liberating?
Yeah, I feel like it
those
could
are the
be
kind of questions.
Straining if you got to meet these expectations to have some sort of social capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's almost like we sort of made it's a difficult thing, because there aren't necessarily individuals to blame, and I think people want individuals to blame sometimes, but it's sort of this, it's living in neoliberal systems that kind of make activism about you and what you can do and how you can feel and things like that, and that's kind of what has happened. And it is a really difficult thing to, I think, talk about, because what I don't want to do is invalidate sort of the experience of people who have been able to dress themselves and feel comfortable in a dress or whatever kind of gender affirming clothing they need, and felt powerful in it. I don't want to invalidate that experience. It's one I have myself. But I am, I suppose, quite cautious of kind of the way that there is now kind of there seems to be, at least to me, a very prescribed way to be kind of a fat person. And it is to kind of engage within, I mean, honestly, a lot of these fast fashion contexts as well, which is a whole other thing.
It's like there's this mold that's out there now, and you got to try and, fit to that mold. And yeah, I think it still sounds constraining to me.
I think so. And I think one of the things that I'd like to do, and there have been kind of elements touched on this already, is talking to people and asking them about if we're talking about healthcare again, thinking about, do people dress up for the doctor, right? You dress up to the doctor because you want the doctor to take you seriously. So like if I go in not in my fat person uniform of like mostly Lucy and Yak these days, my glasses and my hairbrush and things like that, is my treatment going to be worse again? Have we built? Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but that's what that's what I think I would like to. Like to know about.
When you do your research, what type of research are you? Or do you do like autoethnography, qualitative, quantitative? What types of approaches do you use with your research?
Yeah, firmly a qualitative researcher. That's just my preference. Although quants, it has its place and things like this. I think especially when it comes to kind of some data collection, things like that. But I have done sort of autoethnography before, specifically there's kind of more to write about the, journal articles have word limits on them, but there's more to write a kind of like the health journey. Me talking about my experience. I have diabetes, so talking about navigating that as a fat person and my body, it doesn't fit in that good fatty kind of idea. So there are things to kind of talk about there. When I was quite unwell and when I was a PhD student, I didn't have access to money for clothing or the ability to go out and dress in that way anymore. So I believe that I lost some social capital there, actually. And so yeah, I do some autoethnography, and my favorite is to look at life writing, so autobiographies and things that people have written about themselves and blogs and things like that. But as I sort of move into my next research projects, I am going to go do some talking to people. I think it's time to talk to some people in a more specific way. So, but yeah, I really love life writing. I think it's such a gift that people give you about their experiences.
Well, going back to that idea of perceptions of how to dress to get the best healthcare interactions, is that something that you would ever study? Is that within like your vein of research? Yeah.
I mean, that's firstly the title of that you made it sound very much like a BuzzFeed article, which I really enjoyed.
I love it.
As though there was like a checklist. I think so. I think it'd be something. Funding's always a problem, and it can be difficult to get funding to do kind of fat positive stuff, actually. But yeah, I think, and I think it can be really affirming, because I have lots of friends that we've spoken about, and we all say we get dressed properly. You feel awful, but you get dressed properly, you go to the doctor. Could be.
I don't think so. Like, it resonated with me. Like, it resonated with me, and it resonated in all types of circumstances too. Especially like in the professional world, I feel like people dressing the mold, it typically results in being viewed as more professional, and that may not necessarily be the case. It might, you may not be any level of professional, but because you're dressed that way, you're perceived that way.
So maybe there's a perfect patient as well, a professional patient potentially. Yeah. I think there probably is, and I imagine there's probably work on it. We were just talking at the minute. It just sort of popped into my head. Well, popped into my brain.
And then you brought up another good point in that getting funding for research, and I think that's something that has been discussed on this podcast. But as researchers, we're not really up to our own devices a lot of the times. We are meeting a demand. And so I often compete for a publicly competitive notice of funding, and you got to submit, a classic proposal. You got to submit the budget, the associated budget with it. And that notice of funding says, hey, we have some sort of problem. Can you figure that problem out for us and tell us how to move forward, or whatever the implications are? And so I'm now just stuck right in that track. But I don't have the opportunity to be like, hey, I'm really interested in boosting conservation ethic at Yosemite National Park in California, so I'm just going to go research that. And oh, good, my university is going to give me funding. It doesn't happen like that. And so thinking of getting funding for fat studies, that, you mentioned that's really challenging, and it's probably pretty bleak too, I gotta imagine.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm actually on a teaching specific pathway. So acquiring research
Okay.
funding is not part of my job. So the studies I have to do have to be very cheap. They have to be sort of done on top of my teaching. But we did, there's a colleague I have at Goldsmiths, Carly Pendleton. We did manage to get, it's not research, we did manage to get a little bit of funding for like a UK fat studies conference in July, which was really nice, and quite sad and quite surprised that we managed to get it. But and we did, obviously we got some rejections as well, but yeah, it is tough, but it is, I think we have to believe that there are kind of ways to do it out there, and people are being funded to kind of do this work and as part of projects, and they tend to be very health focused and things like that, but we need that health focus as well. So it's a difficult thing talking about funding. Like, yes, there are obviously those barriers when it's tough to be in the social sciences anyway sometimes, but there are often those barriers of access to funding, and it can be risky sometimes, but people are getting it. I'm not saying it's in abundance, but
well, hopefully
they are, like you don't know what to be too pessimistic.
Of course, and hopefully as more and more studies come out, and it shows that type of research is in demand, hopefully more funding will become available. In the meantime, though, have you ever done any research that incorporates a social media analysis at all?
So I am sort of working on it like right now, but I not sort of contemporary social media analysis, and again, using that word contemporary is very strange within the history of the internet. So if you're asked, so specifically, have I ever done anything on Instagram? No, but I would like to. But I did do some stuff around LiveJournal, which for kind of the aged among us will remember, which was sort of like an online community. And for me, I think kind of was a little bit of, I don't think it was intended to be, but there was this LiveJournal site called Fashionista, and I think it was a little bit of an incubator for body positivity. So I have done sort of a little bit on that, and people writing about that retrospectively, and stuff like that. But yes, I would like to. I'm sort of working on the monograph based on this.
Okay. I feel like, was Fashionista, was that in the second article we talked about today? Yeah. Okay, I remembered it.
Yeah.
So, winding down the conversation, you mentioned that you do have some research coming up. Did you want to talk a little bit more about what you do have coming up?
Yes, I mean, hopefully I'm going to be publishing my monograph in the next few years, which is based on some of the ideas we've been talking about today. So it's sort of that history of the body positivity movement through the lens of activism, but looking at things sort of in addition to gender and health, looking at things like sexuality and wellness, and kind of media representation sort of more generally as well. So yeah.
Nice. Well, Dr. Gibson, it's been wonderful having you on Old Bodies Outside, and I really appreciate you coming onto the show to talk about your research. I learned a lot about your research today. I learned a lot about the health, every size movement, fat activism movement. I had never heard of the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health, or the Association of Fat Acceptance. So I'll be looking those up. So appreciate you sharing those. And this is something that's so special about the podcast is, I think we talked about that at the very start, though, is I get to learn from my guests, and it's always such a fun interaction for me. You're welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to throw on that outro music, and we'll call it an episode.